So while William II and Henry both are quite successful in establishing stability, in expanding sort of the purview of the royal government, in increasing sort of revenues and streamlining administration, things do sort of go off the rails at the death of Henry I. Something that probably he had not anticipated. He has something like 20, maybe 21 illegitimate children, but only 2 legitimate children. So his daughter Matilda and his son William. Even so, however, William is a very sort of accomplished young man. He is very well liked. He has sort of a proven military reputation. And so it seems as if Henry doesn't need to worry too much. When his wife Matilda dies, he does remarry. He marries Adeliza of Louvain in 1118, and he's young enough that he could still be having more children. But there is no issue from that particular marriage, and then everything is upended in 1120 when the White Ship sinks. So the White Ship, this is sort of a pretty basic depiction of it here. The White Ship is a royal vessel that Henry has built for young William, who's known as William Atheling, or the sort of Prince William. William and a number of other sort of young nobles are trying to sail from the harbor at Barfleur, which is in France, back to England. There's sort of a delay. We don't know exactly why. We do know that while they're sort of loading the ship, there is a lot of wine that's consumed. We do know that at a certain point in time, William is sort of suggested to William that now it's getting darker. Maybe it's time for them to sail. William sort of delays. Eventually, when they do sail, it's right at dusk. And so visibility is not great. And shortly after they pull away from the harbor, they run aground into a rocky outcropping. No one really knows how to swim. The ship sinks quickly. There are only 2 survivors, and William is not one of them. So this completely upends plans for succession. So what is Henry's options? He has, as I said, a number of illegitimate children, which for various reasons he decides he's not going to try and have them succeed, even though, remember, we're just one generation from William the Conqueror, who himself was illegitimate. But by this time, things have changed, particularly in ecclesiastical attitudes about legitimate marriage and illegitimate marriage, and the notion of an illegitimate child succeeding is no longer really tenable. So he has his daughter Matilda. Matilda was sent to Germany in 1110 when she was about 5 or 6. In 1114 then, so she was raised for several years at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry V. He was quite a bit older than her. He was like in his mid-20s when she first arrived. So they wait until she reaches puberty before they actually marry. This is quite common. So you can see this is a depiction of William in the large circle, his wife Matilda, his son William, and then his daughter Matilda. Henry in the circle. So she then is sort of raised in the court of the Holy Roman Emperor. They are married for over a decade, and then Henry dies. Matilda then is 25, and it's not really clear. There were no children from that union. So, and she's still of marriageable age. So ultimately then, this is after William Atheling has already died. Henry summons her back to England. In 1126 then, he declares her his successor, and at his Christmas court, he has all the leading barons as well as members of the church swear an oath of allegiance that they will accept her as their queen after his death. And they will accept her heirs as their sort of kings or queens sort of moving forward. And then in order to kind of strengthen her position, he has her marry Geoffrey of Anjou in 1128. And for Henry, this is a strategic maneuver because Anjou is next to Normandy. He thinks it's going to provide an important buffer against the kings of France. But it might be a little bit of a miscalculation because we know that Geoffrey of Anjou is not very well liked amongst the other barons of England. And he's particularly not well liked by Matilda. She's like 26, 27, and he's 13. So this is sort of a mismatch to begin with. And it's going to be a very rocky relationship moving forward. The other contender, at least in his opinion, is Stephen of Blois. So he's the nephew of Henry I. He is extremely wealthy, in part because of his royal connections. He's the second wealthiest man in England. He has grown up at the court of Henry, so he actually has that advantage over his cousin Matilda, who's been off in Germany this whole time. We do know that Stephen is sort of a fairly proven military commander. And so he then is able to come. He was sort of over in Boulogne when he heard news of Henry's death. He comes back to England. And he has the support of the people of London, who he's very popular with. And London, because of its sort of centrality and its economic significance, really does play a large role in whose succession is accepted. So he's supported by the people of London, and his brother is also a very high-ranking member of the church. And so between the two, then he's able to convince the barons that they need to sort of forget about the oath they made to Matilda and accept him as king. And you can see from this quote, accounts of Stephen vary. But in this instance, he was not particularly appreciated. And this is from the Peterborough Chronicle. There's a lot of very intense fighting around Peterborough, and so he was a mild man, gentle and good, and did no justice. So again, sort of back to this theme of, do you want sort of a really ruthless yet firm king, so law and order is maintained, but then the flip side is, you know, sometimes they are ruthless and taxes are high? Or do you want someone who is a little bit more fair, a little bit more understanding, but can at times be taken advantage of? So what happens then is civil war. It's a pretty brutal, decade-long sort of series of engagements between Matilda's forces and Stephen's forces for control of England. In 1138, Geoffrey, who's not super interested in invading England, but he's more than happy to mobilize his forces and invades Normandy. In 1139, Robert of Gloucester, who's Matilda's half-brother. So Robert of Gloucester is one of Henry's illegitimate children, who is a very high-ranking noble, and he's a very proven military commander and extraordinarily well-liked and admired. Robert of Gloucester sides with Matilda, and he takes command of her armies. So in 1139, the two of them invade, and then they also have the support of her uncle, who's David, King of Scots, and so he invades from the north. There are some small-scale skirmishes, but mostly the destruction that results from this is because one army will march into a town, the other army will try and hold them off, and then the people get sort of caught in the middle in this sort of siege warfare. And if the one army is forced to retreat, then the town is invaded by the other army. The people are sort of punished because they supported the other's opponent. And one of the ways that the men who are fighting are sort of rewarded for their services, sort of the average foot soldier, is they're allowed to loot and plunder. And there's a lot of rape and destruction that goes along with this. You can kind of see that depiction here. So this is the Battle of Lincoln. So Matilda's forces are trying to hold the castle, and then they're being attacked by Stephen's forces. In 1141, at the Battle of Lincoln, Robert of Gloucester sort of surprises Stephen's forces. Stephen decides to stand and fight, and he actually is captured. So he's forced into a prolonged captivity at Bristol Castle. However, even though he's been captured, his wife, who is also named Matilda, his wife Matilda continues to sort of lead his armies, and not like personally, physically, but organize the opposition. They do not let Matilda be crowned, and they continue to sort of press the case until 1142. They manage to surround Matilda, Queen Matilda, Em- Henry's daughter Matilda, we'll call her Empress Matilda, they managed to surround her in the castle at Oxford. And in order to sort of buy her some time to escape, Robert sort of goes out and meets Stephen's army. And interestingly, we know, we think we know, we're not sure how, but we think we know, she's actually in a third-story tower of the citadel, Empress Matilda is, and she lowers herself onto the ground, and it's winter, so everything is white because of a snowstorm, and so she manages to elude capture. However, Robert is captured and trying to buy her time. So now Empress Matilda has Stephen, Queen Matilda has Robert, and so they agree to a prisoner exchange, which happens in the fall of 1142. And after this temporary sort of hiatus, Stephen is restored to active rule. So this period is generally called sort of the anarchy. In the Peterborough Chronicle in particular, it talks just about the devastation of the countryside, how many people died, how many homes and villages and lands were destroyed. And the quote that he uses is that Christ and the saints slept, because clearly there was no divine protection for England. This is actually a picture of Oxford Castle today, sort of the citadel where Empress Matilda escaped from. These castles go up all across England, probably not this big, but things like this. So some barons actively take sides, and really mean it. So they really are devoted to Stephen, or they really are devoted to Empress Matilda. Some barons sort of switch sides back and forth to try and see which side is going to reward them more. Some barons kind of go rogue and they just sort of try and expand their own authority in the countryside. One of the ways they do that is to build these sort of independent castles. We also know that they go into different villages and they sort of demand protection money. So taking money and goods and any sort of movable wealth that these villagers have. We know there's a lot of famine and hardship because these manors are destroyed in the process of fighting, and that there's a complete breakdown in the legal system, in part because of all this fighting, as there's no one really to sort of keep law, because there's no one in a position of real authority. And then the other thing that sort of has this impact on townspeople and the peasants is this mercenary population. Increasingly, a significant percentage of the royal army are paid mercenaries, and many of them aren't even English. They're imported from Flanders, or they're coming from France, or they're coming from Germany. And so when they're not actively fighting, these mercenaries are sort of roving around the countryside, and they're robbing and they're stealing things, and they're just sort of causing damage. So this is an incredibly sort of destructive decade in the history of England. So the final phase, which ends the war, is sort of a period of negotiation, in part a recognition, particularly by some of the barons, that Stephen doesn't actually have the best personality as a ruler. He, again, is described as very mild-mannered, very personable, but when it comes to making decisions, he's sort of wishy-washy. He lacks some resolve. He doesn't follow through, and that's one of the sort of keys that you need in terms of making sure that if someone tells you they're going to do something, that they do something. So one example is a frequent way to make sure that a truce is secure is you exchange hostages. So you and your enemy will agree that neither of us is going to go into battle against each other, and then you exchange hostages. And the threat is, if that truce is violated, you can kill the hostages. And these hostages are generally like important people. So they're members of your opponent's family, or they're members of their household. And so this is how you keep people keeping their word. And so there's a number of occasions when Stephen has hostages, his opponent violates the terms of the treaty, and instead of killing the hostages, he lets them go, which on the one hand is really generous and reflects sort of his inner morality, but on the other hand, it doesn't help him maintain sort of order, and it doesn't help him keep these vassals in line. So in 1147, you do have this sort of increasing disillusionment with what Stephen's doing as a ruler. So that sort of compounded by the fact that Robert of Gloucester dies. So the barons aren't as committed to fighting for Stephen, and then Matilda loses the person who's really leading her attack in the form of her brother Robert. So you have this sort of temporary cessation of hostilities. In 1148, Matilda withdraws and she goes back to Normandy. She's reunited with her family, which is still there. In the meantime, Geoffrey really ramps up his efforts to conquer Normandy, and by the mid-1150s, he's done that. So now Matilda can at least claim control of Normandy, so Stephen no longer has those resources to count on. And then in 1153, Matilda's eldest son, Henry, who's only 19, but he's actually already a proven battle commander. He's been fighting alongside his father, Geoffrey, for a number of years. Henry invades, and in the face of all of these sort of factors, the barons just aren't interested in continuing to fight. Stephen himself has sort of lost some of the enthusiasm for fighting because his eldest son has just recently died. And so the barons encourage Stephen to come to some sort of negotiated truce with Henry. And so they eventually agree to the Treaty of Winchester, which says that Henry will acknowledge Stephen's right to rule England unimpeded until his death, at which time the crown of England will pass to Henry. Whether or not that would have sort of played out in the future, or if this was just Stephen buying time, we don't know, because shortly after the Treaty of Winchester is signed, Stephen actually becomes ill and he dies. And so this is an image of Henry next to Matilda, his mother. She never does, in fact, become Queen of England. She's never crowned, but in her successors, she does lay the foundation for what will be the Plantagenet rule of England, and Plantagenets will rule England uninterrupted from 1154 until the death of Richard III in 1485.